Hello all my rad friends and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be about hip shape and in particular high hips, even more in particular high wide hips. That is what I have, and I see a lot of women in different like fashion groups that I am a member of or Reddit boards, and a lot of them are feeling kind of weird about their clothing. They don't like the way clothing fits on them, or they don't understand why they don't look right in their clothes. And what I've learned is that a lot of people who think it's about the Kibbe system or whatever, there are a lot of valid points in that, but one thing that Kibbe does not address or talk about is hip height. And hip height does not correspond to Kibbe body type. It does not correspond to a lot of different body type systems. You can be any body type and have high or low hips, but understanding what high hips are and how they affect the way you look in clothing, I feel like it's huge and people don't talk about it. And me personally, I was super negatively affected by this misunderstanding by both me and I guess people around me. My personal example is that I was in the military for 10 years and I always looked bad and frumpy in my uniforms. I could spend hours ironing them and starching them, and I still would look frumpy or wrinkled and rumpled within minutes of wearing it. And it was actually affecting my performance evaluation scores, because that's something that they can actually score you in the military on is your military appearance, if you look professional and neat. And there is no way to make clothing that isn't shaped for your body look neat on your body. And this impacted the course of my life. I ended up leaving the military because I had, despite working my butt off and trying really hard and priding myself on my professional knowledge, I was always ranked really low because they didn't like the way that I looked in uniform. They said I was fat. They said all these negative things. And there were times when I was heavier, but there were also times when I was thinner, and it didn't make any difference on how I was perceived because I didn't have that slender, hipped appearance that was the ideal, I guess, in their minds that I was being held against. And because of my low performance scores, I left the military when, if you would ask me when I was 18, I was planning on staying in for a career. I've changed jobs, I've moved cities. I mean, this is something that affected the whole course of my life, which is kind of crazy to think. And the second part of that is it really negatively affects people's opinions of themselves when they don't understand that the way the clothes look on them is because of the shape of their hips, and it has nothing to do with them being fat or frumpy or they're just not pretty or whatever. It can really negatively affect your self-opinion when you think that you're doing something wrong, and it's just that the shape of the clothes are like not made at all for people with high and wide hips. So that sounds very dramatic, and I guess it can be, but it can also be like very liberating and fun once you realize that this is what it is, because then you realize that it's just the clothes and that there's things that you can do to kind of help yourself dress better once you understand that that's what the problem is. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to talk about is like, what are high hips? I'm going to put an image up on the screen and we're going to talk about the shapes that it shows in there. There are actually two different things that determine the shape of your hips, and one of them is going to be your ilium flare, and the other one is going to be, I don't know how to pronounce that, trochanter. And the trochanter is the shape of the top of your hip bone, and the ilium flare is the shape of the actual hip. And both of those can affect what we call our hips, because when we talk about our hip shape, we're not just talking about the actual pelvis bone, we're talking about the overall curve that takes you from your waist to basically the start of your thighs. So my actual combination that I have is not one of these pictures. I think I have a wide and high ilium flare. They don't have that combination in here. And I don't know, I'm not sure exactly which one of like my leg bones is, but I think that I also have a Y and high like trochanter or whatever it is, shape of my femur, like the top of my femur. And you can see in here that different shapes have hip dips and some have different hip dips than others. And you can also see how everyone here has a slightly different shape of their hips. Everyone's going to have a slightly different combination of these. So everyone's hip shape is going to be different. Like when I say I have high and wide hips, you might have high and wide, like actual hip bones, but it would be like slightly different shaped, or the shape of the tops of your femurs are going to be slightly different. So everyone's hip shape is going to be a little bit different. And I think that nothing I'm saying is going to be like a perfect fit for you, but I think that if you do have that high and wide ilium flare, you are going to kind of recognize or identify with a lot of these problems that I'm talking about. I think that it's good to talk about some examples of each of these body types to help us understand them a little better. I think that a really good example of the narrow hip would be someone like Kate Middleton. Kate Middleton has pretty narrow hips, but they also look pretty low. That is, everyone has a little bit of a hip shape, a little bit of like a pelvis, a little bit of curve there, but hers curve seems to start really low. And I think that you can especially see that sometimes in clothing that has darts around the hip area, and that upper hip area is always very kind of loose and open. I think a great example of that second picture of the narrower ilium flare, but with the wider femurs, I think a good example of that is Bella Hadid. And Bella Hadid is known to have hip dips, and I think that is kind of just confirmed. You see this in the second picture. I think a good example of that third hip shape, in my mind, would be someone like Sofia Vergara. She is commonly talked about when people talk about wider hips, and she does have a wider curve to her hip, and it does give her a little bit more of a curved shape on her hips, but I still think ultimately she does not have that like super high and wide hips that I'm trying to address here. I think Rachel Maksy is a perfect example of the last picture. She made a whole video about her hip dips and about how that affected her self-esteem, and I think so she's got higher hips and in a low trochanter, and I think that especially when you have the high hips and the low trochanter makes more of a pronounced hip dip. And I think that that's affected her life in a lot of ways too. I mean, I don't know her personally. She did make a whole video about it, but I've noticed that she never really wears clothes that are tight in that area. And maybe that's one of the reasons why she does love her sort of like whimsical and vintagey style, is because she finds ways to basically not show her hips, because so much clothing is not really made for that shape. And then the last one that I don't think is pictured here is the high trochanter with the high and wide hips. And that's, I think, what I am, and I think that Christina Hendricks has that shape as well. There are a lot of examples of Christina Hendricks' hips, and I think you can really see that shape. So now that we've talked about like different examples of these types of high hips, now let's talk about the types of fit issues that this high and wide hip shape causes. So the first is that skirt shapes are going to be really wrong for your body a lot of the times. Now this is a skirt, this is a typical skirt, and look at this hip shape here. Look at the side of the hips here. Now, this is meant for someone with a more of a straight line, a lower hip shape. And when I wear this, it is too tight up here. It is too tight up in this upper hip area. There's just not enough room for the shape of my hips because my hips aren't straight like this. And I'm gonna make a little drawing that kind of demonstrates what I mean more, because I feel like this could be it's kind of like hard to say. So I'm going to be drawing some little drawings that kind of exaggerate it. So you can see the shape of the hips here. And basically right in that upper part of the skirt where the hip is straight, the hips, there's not enough room for the actual hip. So your skirt ends up riding up. That's not to say that if your skirt rides up, the answer is always because you have high hips. It could be that if any one part of the skirt, if the skirt is not shaped right for your body, if there's any one part of the skirt that is tightest, most skirts are bigger at the bottom. So the skirt will basically ride up until that bigger part is around the part of you that is constricting movement in the skirt. So if you have high hips, it's gonna move up and so that that upper hip area has a little bit more room, and you're gonna be constantly pulling your skirts down. So then what do? So then you size up the skirt, and then the rest of the skirt doesn't fit right because it's too big and it just sort of hangs off you. So that's not ideal. That also leads into the next point, which is that a lot of times if you have higher hips, your waist is going to be a little bit larger. Now, I have been everything from like a size 16 to like, I don't know, really tiny. I was like a 5, and for me, that was like borderline underweight. I was about 125 pounds at 5'7", and considering I do have bigger boobs, a lot of that weight was there. I was cold all the time. It hurt to sit on chairs because my butt would poke into them, like my hip bones would poke into them. I was very thin, and yet I still had that high hip shape. Yet my waist was never very small. Like my waist did not get to 24, 25 inches or something like that. When I'm looking at clothing sizes, I'm frequently limited by the size of my stomach and not like their hip width. Even though I look like I have very wide hips, a lot of that is illusion because I have a flat butt. The actual measurement of my hips is a size smaller than the measurement of my waist. Christina Hendricks, when she does not have her waist snatched in with a girdle, you can see she also has a little bit, her waist is not as like snatched as it looks in Mad Men when she's not wearing a girdle. There's no amount of dieting or exercising that is going to make your stomach significantly smaller in diameter because you just like you have your organs in the way, you have your hips in the way, you have your ribs in the way. It's just not going to happen. There's often a very short distance. And that is because when you have high hips, the space between your hip bone and your ribs is a lot smaller. So the body doesn't have like enough like length to go into a smaller waist before it has to go back out to the hips, if that makes sense. So I want to talk about my hip shape in general and kind of demonstrate these things. You can see here that my hip kind of curves out, and this is not fat. This is the shape of my hip, and nothing is ever going to change that. I have been thin. I've been very thin. I have very few pictures of when I was thin, when I was about 125 pounds, but I'll show you like the one I have that I think kind of shows my hips. You can't, my arm's in the way, my arm's in the worst spot, but you can kind of see that even still, I had that kind of shape of hips. And you can also see, I think more clearly, that it goes right from hips to rib cage. There's like very little in between. And that I still, even when thin, had a bit of a thicker waist.
Here's another video of me at a, I think, slightly higher weight, and you can see the hip shape is still the same. And I know I'm like beating a dead horse with this, but I really want to reiterate that I always thought that my hip shape was due to extra weight. And then I lost the weight and I realized that it definitely was not. I know that sounds really obvious, but I don't know. I think a lot of women spend a lot of time thinking that if they just lost a little more weight, they would finally have the body that looked like, you know, name whatever celebrity. And that's just not the case.
So you are going to have a bigger waist. On the flip side, the benefit of that is that if you do wear something that cinches your waist in even a little bit, then your waist is going to look extra small. I think case in point is Christina Hendricks. Now, she has said that when she filmed Mad Men, she was wearing very constrictive girdles that drew her waist in, but you can see that it makes her waist look very small in comparison to her high hips. And that's why a lot of times Victorian women would pad their hips to make their waist appear tinier. So it can make it harder to buy clothes because the clothes themselves in your given size that fits the rest of your body might not be the right shape in the stomach. But on the flip side, it can make the illusion of high hips can make your waist look tinier, especially if you wear something that like snatches it in even just a tiny bit. So another thing that, I mean, I'm not 100% sure on this because like I didn't study anatomy, but just from me anecdotally seeing my friends that have the similar shape to me and also being in these fashion communities online, on Facebook, on Reddit, is that a lot of people with high hips also tend to have kind of flat butts. And I don't know why that is, but it's also where that like white woman flat butt kind of meme comes from, and it can make your butt look almost like an inverted triangle. And I'm not sure what the cause is, but I personally think it's because when your muscles that stretch from like your hip bone, like in the muscles in your butt that stretch from like your hip bones down across your pelvis, when they have further to go, I feel like they lay flatter and they aren't as bunched up. I feel like I don't know if that's true or not. I'm kind of just like how I make it make sense in my head, but I don't know if there have been like studies on this or not, because I don't think anybody cares enough to actually study these things. But that is what I think. But I just tend to notice that when you have higher hips, you also tend to have a flatter butt. And as I talked about in my disco pants video, if you have wide hips and a flat butt, that really affects how pants can fit you. There's a thing called a sieve curve, which is basically the garment manufacturer's guess for how like basically deep you are like on a side profile. So they assume that, let's say you have a 40-inch diameter for your hips, they have to make an assumption, how wide are your hips for that given diameter? If you're going to be more like this, sort of like a top view, like with wider hips and a flatter butt, or if you're going to be more like this, so narrower hips with a rounder butt. And that can also really affect how your clothes fit. It can mean that your clothes are baggy in the butt and crotch area. And that can be really weird because you're like, well, these pants fit me. They fit around my hips, but I have like a saggy butt. And I remember in particular, the jeans in my high school that all the girls wear were mud jeans. And those were notorious for giving people like flat, saggy butts. But we all wore them anyway because that was what was cool. Another common fit issue that can be caused by high hips are that things that are gathered in the waist are going to splay out in a really kind of not attractive way. And that's basically because the fabric is gathered, and the way that the garment is manufactured, it kind of assumes that it's going to be gathering and then laying in kind of this shape. But what happens is, because your hips are more curved, it gathers and then hits your hips and then sort of like flows out from there, meaning that it kind of hides the shape of your hip, and it can make you kind of just feel like you look really wide in a weird way. Like it makes you have kind of like a hip shelf is what I like to call it. And it's like all the fabric hits that shelf and then just hangs down from there and really accentuate kind of a more boxy shape to the hips, or even an inverted triangle shape. So that is another problem. And the last problem is that low-rise pants are going to just not work for you. And if you've ever felt like your pants, they come up on the sides and then dip down in the center, that's because the rise of the pants is not high enough. Now, we all try to hitch our pants up above our hip bone so that they don't fall off. If the rise is too low and the edge of the hip band can't actually hook on top of your hip bones, that means they're going to be constantly sliding down. And I don't mean the hip bones that poke out in the front, that's the lower part, but I mean the hip bones on the back and the side. And that might be easy. You say, well, I'll just not wear low-rise pants, right? But when you have high and wide hips, even a high-rise pair of pants is not going to actually be above your hip bones. I think my rise for something to be on top of my hips is somewhere between 13 and 14 inches. And the average high-rise pair of pants is 11 inches, which means I'm constantly pulling things up at the side, and which means I'm constantly trying to battle the slowing down of that. If you watch my disco pants video, I talked about that there. Now that American Apparel pants are being made by a different manufacturer, they've changed the rise, and now they are no longer as high. So I keep pulling them up on the side to prevent them from falling down my hips. But that's not, it doesn't just happen in disco pants. It happens with a lot of pants. So if you're someone whose pants, you're always pulling them up higher on the sides and they dip down in the middle, what that means is those pants aren't a high enough rise to prevent them from sliding down your hips, and that you're pulling them up because pants are not made with high hips in mind. Now that we've talked about the fit issues, let's talk about things that we can do and details you can pay attention to in your clothes that will kind of help you around this issue. So we already talked about skirts, how most skirts have this straighter shape and this shape that is just generally like this. So if you are talking about getting a straight skirt, what you're going to do is you're going to size up, and then you're going to make sure that it has something in it to cinch the waist in. Okay, so you can see that the tightest part of this is right here because it's made straight. And whenever I like sit down, it just rides up. It just is not made for my shape. And it's tightest right here. This skirt is very similarly shaped, but because I was able to size up and cinch it in, it fits me a lot better, and it just stays on my hips a lot better. And I do not have nearly the problems with this riding up because it's not too small in this area. I mean, it's tight, but it's kind of like designed to be tight. Also of note though, that when I'm cinching it in, it is a stiffer fabric, so it really holds kind of the pleats that I'm putting into it stiff and straight. Now, there are some skirts that are made with that shape, with the more high hip curve shape in mind, but it's like they account for the high hips, but they often don't account for the fact that proportionally your waist is a little bit larger. So let's say you're a size 10 in jeans, and then you find this skirt, and let's say you size up to a 14 to get it big enough in the upper hip area, and you can cinch the waist in a little bit. But if you find those size 10 pants that do have a little bit more area in the hip, upper hip, it might be that after that, it's too small in the waist because you, for your body, have a slightly larger waist than other parts of your body.
I know this sounds really strange, and I don't know if I'm quite making sense here, but I think essentially why this is happening, I mean, you would think that a pencil skirt with that sort of like high hip, high curve shape would be ideal. Like I could just buy one of those and it would fit me perfectly, but they rarely do. And I don't think I really could figure out why. Like, why would a straight skirt in, say, a size 10 have enough room in the waist, the biggest area of concern being the high hip area being too small, but the waist fitting, but then a pencil skirt not fit in the same size 10 by the same company? Why would the waist be so much smaller? And I've thought about this a lot, and I think that the reason is this. A straight skirt is designed to sit right at the top of your hips. If you do not have high hips, the top of your hips, it's a little bit further from your natural waist. So the maker of the skirt assumes that it's not at the smallest point of the size 10's stomach. So they actually make the waistband of it a little bigger because it's supposed to fit kind of around the hips and not quite around the natural waist. But if you have high hips, if you're trying to wear that straight skirt, your waistband is going to end up way up at your natural waist just because the top of your hips is very close to your natural waist. I mean, they're pretty much being over the top of your hips is pretty much being at your natural waist. So the waistband of the size 10 fits you on the straight skirt because it's actually meant to be around the hips of someone with like a lower hip shape. So then if you get a size 10 skirt that is made for someone with high hips, like a pencil skirt with a high hip shape, they are assuming now that you have it at your natural waist, which is around your belly button. And as I mentioned before, I think if you have high hips, your waist is always going to be slightly bigger for the rest of you. So where a size 10 might fit my whole body normally, just right at my natural waist, I'm just like an inch bigger than a size 10. And since the pencil skirt is designed to sit at the natural waist of the size 10 person, it's going to be a little too small in the waist. Whereas the straight skirt fits me through the hips, but because it's meant to end kind of just above the hips on a lower hipped person, which is not their natural waist. On me, it's my natural waist. That waistline is a little bit bigger. It's like I said, it's kind of confusing, but I think that's what's going on. Why, for some reason, pencil skirts are too small in the waist, but like virtually every other type of skirt is not. I don't know. That's my theory, guys. It's just a theory. I could be really off. If you know better than me why this is, like, please let me know.
So I often don't wear skirts. If I do, they're very stretchy. I've also found that in general, dresses will fit me a little better than separates. And if I do wear a structured skirt, I make sure I would almost rather have a straight skirt than that I can cinch in with a built-in belt rather than try to get one that is shaped more curved, because this stomach size is often too small, and then I end up having to size up anyway, and then the whole thing doesn't look right. So when it comes to pants, an important thing to look at are the pleats and the gathers in the pants. I wear a lot of tight clothes because it's easiest when they're just tight and stretchy to be tight around the hips and fit that shape perfectly because they're stretchy. But if we're talking about something that's not stretchy, like wider, looser clothing, relaxed fit, or slacks that are of a tailored material, it can be really important to pay attention to how the fabric is sewn around the waistband. You want to look for several things. Number one is you want to have something that has pleats or gathers that lay flat, and they can either be sewn to lay flatter or just be a stiffer material that keeps the pleats a little bit more laid down. And I know this goes against recommendations for certain like kibby body types. For instance, for my body type, they say everything should be soft and flowy, but like I said, shelf hips. So I go for a little bit more construction and shape around the waistband of things.
For me personally, I have found that one of the best ways to get that shape and construction is with a paper bag waist. And now you might be thinking that that would be a type of style that would add a lot of actual like volume and extra fabric around the waist and it make you look bulkier, but I have found exactly the opposite. And that has to do with like the very unique construction of a lot of paper bag waist pants. How they fit you is that a lot of them will have a really high waist, something that is designed to fit you almost above your natural waist so that the bottom of what is usually a cinched belted waist, so that the bottom of that hits you around your natural waist. Then from there, the fabric, if it is stiff enough, will hang straight down past your hips. Now, it's really important to notice that small gap between the fabric right at your natural waist at the top of your hips. Once again, you would think that would make you look bigger by kind of going over that small part of your waist, but what that does is actually create a really nice streamlined shape. And I found this to be really flattering. And this is important to note, though, that this is with a stiffer fabric.
I have here two pairs of paper bag style pants. And they don't have their belts with them, but they came with like matching belts. And you can see construction wise, they're very similar. Something that makes these great is, first of all, it has sewn flat darts in the back. So there is some shaping here around the waist that is actually sewn into place. Then on the front, you have pleats, but this is a stiffer fabric, and the stiffness of the fabric holds these pleats pretty straight and flat. Now you compare them to this. This has a few darts in the back, but not as many. So there's not as much shaping. So it's a little bit straighter and I have to cinch it in more. And then in the front, we have a ton of these pleats. Now this fabric is really soft, and when it hits my hips, it doesn't hold its own shape at all. It completely flares out and it just sort of hangs from my hips. There's actually kind of a little bit of a gap here because it's simulating a straight shape from here to here by kind of glossing. I wear it up a little high and then it sort of glosses over that gap right here a little bit. But you have to be careful because a lot of times I sort of fudge this issue of clothes not being high-rise enough by just getting clothes that were meant to have a little bit of a dropped waist like these and pulling them up higher. But what that means is that a lot of times then the pants are too short and I'm showing my ankles. But you can see how this gives a little bit, I'll tuck this in, of a straighter appearance. And that these pleats are, for the most part, staying pretty closed. They're not like doing this. They stay flat. So this is a great example of something, it just hits here and then it just hangs straight down because this fabric is soft enough that the pleats just open and hang straight down. And you can see that shape. It's not the shape that I want, and these don't give the effect that I want. You can also see that these are high-waisted, and because our waist starts up so high and we have that small gap between our hips and our ribs, this is literally up to on my boob. And I know that like it is supposed to be a very high-waisted structured style, but this is so high that it throws me completely out of proportion and just starts to look kind of ridiculous. So these are a big no, and I'm going to be decluttering them soon. I really wanted to love these. They looked lovely in the online pictures, but this fabric is just too soft. Even the same exact waistline with a less stiff fabric than these pants can give you a much similar to something that's just gathered. I also did a video last year when my channel was pretty new, about a year and a half ago when my channel was pretty new, and I showed that I had rented a whole bunch of different styles of pants to try to figure out what would look good on me because I wanted to wear something besides tight pants. This was something I figured through trial and error, and I think that can be really helpful. I think if all of this is sounding like it might make sense, but you're not really sure if it would work on you, I highly recommend using a clothing rental service for a few months and just like really honing in on like pants and bottoms and getting like variations of a type. Like, oh, I'm going to do all paper bag pants, but there's going to be ones with like slightly different fabrics and shapes, and then really hone in on what it is that would make something work for your hip shape. I also think it's important that I often use things to cinch in my waist. As we talked about in the beginning, cinching in your waist, even just a little bit to draw attention to your waist, can really make your waist look tiny, even when it's actually bigger than most people would think. I mean, when you look at Christina Hendricks, her waist looks absolutely tiny, but it's kind of an optical illusion because her hips are so high. And that is why the Victorians used to pad their hips. We have this idea that Victorians just laced their waists really tight, and a few like young fashionable people did, but for the most part the desired silhouette was achieved by padding the hips to make them look bigger instead of trying to cinch the waist in. So having something where the waist is cinched in can really make your waist look tiny. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about wearing a corset or a girdle. I'm talking about like something like this, where a belt like this, and I know that depending on your fashion sense, you may think this is like out of style, but I've sort of like changed my style to accommodate what my body needs in terms of fit. And so I wear these a lot. I know that if you follow, like, this is not like French woman chic or whatever, but I think that these belts like this can be super flattering on your waist and really make it look cinched in and really make your waist look a lot smaller, and can also provide that shaping to the fabric like the belted skirts did and the belted paper bag waist. Please ignore this. These pants have a nice shape that bring them in a lot, but by adding a belt and cinching it in just a tiny amount, I feel like it, guys, just ignore that. It really gives my waist a super tiny appearance, even though, I mean, I think I have like a 32-inch waist and my hips are only like 38 inches because my butt is so flat. But even with this belt, my waist looks so much tinier, even though I have like barely cinched. I mean, I've not made my waist significantly smaller, but just that little bit of cinching in your clothes right at the top can really give the appearance of a much tinier waist because of that shape of the hip. Ignore the shirt ties. I just wanted to keep the same shirt on for consistency so that you guys could see how much the shape of the bottom affects the overall appearance given the same shirt. And the last fit tip I have, it's kind of something I've been talking about all along, is that you're just going to really want to make sure that you get things in a higher rise than they're labeled as. I don't think I'm saying that right. But what I mean is that if you want a low rise look, you can do that. But you just have to understand that you're not going to get that low rise look with low rise pants. They're going to look ridiculous on you. You should get mid rise pants, and mid rise will be the low rise fit on you. They will be at the point on your hips where a low rise fit would be on someone with lower hips. And if you want a mid rise look, you should get just regular high rise jeans. They have about an 11-inch rise on average. Some are as low as 10 and a half, some can be a little higher, and that is going to, your standard high rise is going to be your mid rise. And if you want a high rise look, you're going to have to go out of your way to find like ultra high rise pants. It's something that I always look for now that I understand this. If I want high rise, and I'll even go so far as to email or like chat with customer service, and they usually will have those measurements. And I'm often shocked at how even something called ultra high rise will be like 11 and a half or 12 inches. And that's just like strange to me. I find independent and small brands, when they call something high rise, are usually like a little higher. But I often, if I want a high rise look, I'll look for something that's around 13 to 14 inches. Another dressing tip, because you have a higher waist, is that shirt lengths are going to hit you a lot differently than they will on someone else. And that you might have to shorten your shirts if you want them to hit like right at your hip bone. I think another important thing is understanding that your clothes will have a tendency to go right from your shoulders to your hips. And that if you don't have anything cinching it in or showing your waist, it can be very easy for you to look very boxy up top too. And this can happen commonly happens to women with a big bust as well. But even with a big bust, if you have narrower hips, it won't be quite the same. If you have big boobs and high hips like me, then you're going to look very wide. And I don't always have a problem with a bigger silhouette. One of my favorite things to wear the past couple winters has been these like looser paper bag style pants and then like a giant sweater. But the sweater ends at my natural waist, and the paper bag pants have a belt at the waist that I cinch in. And that really shows my waist a little bit. Now, if I wear a sweater that is big and bulky and hits where on other people would be just the top of their hip bones, but on me is like it's like mid hip. It's like a couple inches below my hip bones. It obscures it obscures my waist completely, and it can be a very boxy shape as well. So you're just going to want to be aware that you're going to want to show off your waist. You might want your shirts to end a little shorter, just like you want your pants to be a little higher.
So let's look at some examples of, for instance, a sweater. Now, the sweater on the left hangs down and it's designed to hit the woman around the top of her hips, the same about space that a mid-rise pair of pants would hit. And the person on the right, you'll see with the high hips, now they're probably going to have to stretch it a little out if they want to wear it like over their hips like that. And you can see it's going to create a much boxier shape. Now, when you like fill that in to see what that would look like in person, like with a, not see-through shirt, you're seeing that the person on the right is going to look way bigger and way boxier because that high hip is making that sweater hit at the widest point of their hips, whereas on the person with a little bit lower or more average height hip, the sweater is hitting above the actual hip itself. So then let's see what it looks like when we talk about having a cropped shirt. Now you can see with the cropped shirt, now I have slightly exaggerated the shape, but you can see the cropped shirt on the person with the high hips is really going to be able to show off the waist. Now I like to get sweaters that are a little bit tighter fitting through the stomach, or I cinch it in with a belt, or I tuck it into my shirt. The person on the left, it's going to look cropped, especially because the pants they're wearing are likely going to only go up to the top of their hips. And maybe if they get a high rise, it will maybe meet towards the bottom end of their shirt. But if you have high hips and you've gone to the trouble of making sure that your bottoms are like that ultra high rise that will get above your hip bones, then that shirt is going to come right down to it, and you're really going to like accentuate the hourglass. Whereas a person on the left, it's going to look like a crop top, and on you, it's just going to look like a shirt that comes to your pants. It's going to look less cropped effectively. Like the shirt I'm wearing in this video, I think on a lot of people would look cropped and would show some of their belly, and on me, it just comes to my natural waist and really shows that waist off. I mean, it's up to you. I do wear like regular length shirts too. I'm not always looking for like something to show off my figure, but this is just to keep in mind that a regular length shirt on you is going to make you look way boxier than that same shirt would look like on someone with a lower or more average height or shaped hips.
Because the widest point of your hips is going to be a lot higher than the widest point of other people's hips. Now, I remember when I was in the military and they would have to take our measurements, and the widest point, they always said the widest point of your hips, like the guide on how to do it said the widest point of your hips was like around your butt. And for me, that was not the case. The widest point of my hips was always up near my belly button. And that's where a lot of clothing ends. So if you're wearing high-rise pants, they'll actually fit you like a mid-rise and end somewhere around the widest part of your hips. And then you wear a normal shirt with that. You're basically creating a waistline around the widest part of your hips, and it's going to look a lot wider on you. So you really need to be aware of the effect that higher point of your hips and your higher waistline are going to have on your clothes. Like I said, I go out on my way to get higher waisted things, and I go out on my way to get shirts that are either longer and kind of avoid the area completely and go for maybe more of a tunic length, or I get them shorter so they end closer to my natural waist. I hope that people have found this video helpful. I know not everyone is going to have the exact shape of hips. So some people's solutions or some people's way of dressing their shape of hips, even if they do have high hips, they'll be slightly different than mine. The way they dress and accommodate them will be different than the way I do, but this is what I have found helpful. And so if you have high hips like me, I hope that some of these tips have been helpful for you. And I think that we should all just remind ourselves that there's no magic diet, there's no magic workout routine, and there's no magical clothing that is going to change the shape of your skeleton, and that you are perfect the way you are, and it's the clothes that aren't made to fit you. So I think that that's a really important message that I wish that I had internalized, like really internalized, not just known mentally, but really internalized, I don't know, like 20 years ago. That would have been helpful. But anyway, you guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.